We're going to pick up, obviously, the third day. The first day, as you might remember, and this is kind of deliberate and just kind of the way things go, but we tried to set the stage for management and the legal system in Maryland and what management means and some of the pitfalls and things of that nature. And we got into more detail the second day, and now we will continue with more detail. And I think today we will probably, by the half of the day, your eyes will be glazed over and you'll be punch happy because we're going to throw a lot of stuff at you. So as always, ask lots of questions, make comments. If you don't understand, let me know you don't understand. And some things it just takes time to sink in. I understand that. And again, that's one of the reasons why we have taken such pains, if I can put it that way, to put this information down in relative detail on the slides. It would be nice if we had a textbook and the textbook would give you all the detail and we could do what normally is done with PowerPoint, and that's just hit the highlights because you could read something else for the details, but we don't have that. So this is the textbook. And maybe someday we'll get from this to something more detailed, but that day is not today, so we will continue. Tools to manage performance. And as Gary has said, half of the battle, and maybe not even half the battle, but only part of the battle is getting to the point of awarding a contract. The other part, whether it's more than 50%, whatever, is once you have a contract awarded, you have a vendor, now the issue is, as Gary already said, getting what we have contracted for. Because as we say in the overview class, you have two parts of the equation and both parts have to work together for you to get what it is that you're doing a procurement to get. You have to have your specifications written properly, you have to do the procurement process properly and use that process to select a good vendor. So if you don't have good specifications, a good contract, a good vendor, etc., you're going to have problems trying to manage. And conversely, even if you do have a good contract and a good vendor, if you fall down on the contract management side, you're still not going to get the full performance that we have the right to expect from the procurement that we did. So we're telling you more of the tools, and something I have emphasized before, I will emphasize again, is a lot of the stuff we're talking about when you're in contract management, and lots of times you'll think to yourself, gee, I wish I would have known that when I was putting together specifications. Then I would have said this in the specifications so it would have been in the contract to begin with. And yes, that is the ideal, that these things are built into the contract to begin with. But in most instances, even if they're not, there's still something you can do. And the other thing that we said is it's always better to start at some point than to never start at any point during the term of a contract. Even if it's 2 years into a 3-year contract, you still have another year to try to get as much as you can from that third year. But the other part of this particular stage, what is called perform, is the overlap between managing an in-place contract and starting to think and starting to plan for the one that's going to come after that, so that you can, to as much as possible, apply the lessons and the issues in your existing contract, but you certainly can start incorporating it into a successor contract that's going to be coming up and going to be procured and awarded, ideally, before the current contract is expired. So that's supposedly setting the stage, and it's also getting me more back into the tune of things. We'll go through each of these points of what these are as far as managing, how you use them, what that gets you. And again, most of these are built into the specifications to begin with, or perhaps via modification if necessary. All right, let's see. I think I probably already said that. The ideal is to have these in the contract to begin with in the specifications, but if you don't, to the extent that you can modify to do them, generally that is a good thing. But the issue when you try to do it after the fact is this one. The vendor may claim that you have to pay money in order to get a modification to do these things. All right.
Those of you who do not have that slide, pay attention.
That slide?
Well, these slides, until we get to the next group, I don't have any more slides. So until we get to 458, pay attention. All of you receive, unless you're new to this class, all of you have these slides from the last time. And I only have 3 to give out today. They're done.
Okay. Observation. Now this is hardly even worth mentioning, I guess, because this is the most obvious thing. That if you have a situation where the vendor is working on your premises and it's something where, bless you, where the vendor's not just sitting there typing something into a computer or something like that, but they're doing some physical activity, and if they're doing it on your premises, you can see whether, number one, they seem to be busy, whether they seem to be walking around all the time or standing around talking to other people. So you can do observation to see whether the vendor at least seemingly is doing work, and depending upon how obvious it is, like the example of janitorial services, you can see whether they're sweeping the floors, mopping, doing things of that nature, simply because they're doing it on your premises and you're on your premises, so you can look at them. And you can note if you see them standing around or a lack of people. It's like, where is anybody? Things of this nature. So the simplest type of monitoring is, if you can, simply look and noting what you observe. Let's see. Work is in extract. So the observation, sometimes you will want to, you'll just see it in terms of the day-to-day activities. Sometimes you'll have to make a specific concerted effort to do that. I remember back when I was here at this department, and the person who, to me, always typified the ideal contract manager, and probably most of you will not know the name Ruby McDonald, but she was the chief of dietetic services for the department for probably 20 years, something like that. And she was my ideal of what a contract manager would be. And since food service at the facilities has to be prepared and provided 3 meals a day, the first one starting, 7 o'clock, something like that in the morning, vendors that were providing food service had to be on site at 5 or 5:30 in the morning doing things to prepare, and they had to be doing cleanup after the 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock p.m., whenever the supper was. They had to be doing cleaning and things like that. So they would stretch over a 12-hour or more period of time, some of them obviously not being within the normal work time frame for most people that work in central office. But Ruby had planned that she would, on weekends, because there's food service on weekends, she would pick certain weekends, certain times when she would pop up at a facility unannounced at 5 a.m. in the morning, at 7 p.m. in the evening, come in on a Saturday, come in on a Sunday, so she could walk in to the vendor's activity and see who was there, what were they doing, did they have things cleaned, did they seem to be preparing things properly. So she did this observation, and she did what was in this second part here, where she made extra effort to observe the work during non-standard times, and that's important. You don't want a vendor who's going to do the job just during the normal work hours and then figuring, okay, while the cat's away, the mice will play type of thing. Otherwise, you want to make sure they're doing everything consistently the whole time they're working and supposedly getting paid. Now, sometimes reports and things like that will tell you this, but other times you actually have to be there and see it, and if you do, there should be specific effort to try to get there on unannounced times so you can see what the vendor's doing, which is what that says. If work is not done at the agency site, there might be wording in the contract that permits inspection of the contractor's work site. Now, if you're going on the contractor's work site, typically you may or may not have the ability to walk in unannounced. It depends on, first of all, what you've written in the contract, and second of all, their security issues and things of that nature. So maybe you need at least some degree of advance notice, at least an hour, a day, something like that. But whatever it is, you should have the right, obviously, to, if it's important, to see from a quality control standpoint what they're doing on their own premises, put it in the specifications, and then the other part is, it's one thing to simply put them in the specifications. The thing that's more important is following through. That even if you have something that says, I have the right to do this, but the contract has gone for 3 years and you've never done it, never said you're going to do it, no hint of it. In fact, you might have said, you're never going to catch me getting anywhere at 5 o'clock in the morning. You've told the vendor, they don't have to worry about it. So you need to be conscientious and make efforts to do these type of things. Again, if you have to have prearranged notice, that means they have the ability to know something is coming and the ability to perhaps do some cleanup or do something to make it look better than it might be at other times when it's unannounced. Try to do unannounced. If you can't, then at least try to, a minimum amount of time for notification as possible, so they have as little time as possible to try to get things looking perhaps unlike what they look like in normal times. But it is worthwhile to visit because they can't clean up everything in a short notice. So, observation. Even if there is not wording in the solicitation or contract to permit vendor work site inspections, the vendor shouldn't object to such inspections. Ideal, as I've said, broken record, to have it in the specs that you can clearly say this is something that was in the specifications, you should not object to it. But even if you don't, such as if this is the first time you're hearing that this is a desirable activity, then you can either try to modify the contract or simply call up the vendor and say, I'd like to come and visit your work site, if that is something appropriate for the nature of the work to be done. And normally, they shouldn't say, oh no, you can't come see where we actually do work. We don't want you here, unless there is some kind of security issue, which I don't know there would be, but for the most part, bring it up, see what kind of objection they raise, and try to just get their cooperation. And if a vendor is doing everything properly, most of the time they won't have any problem whatsoever. In fact, lots of them will embrace the fact that you want to come and visit. And they'll say, oh yeah, we'd be delighted to show you. We have this really great operation and we think you'll really be impressed. You'll see how well we're doing the work for you. That's a good thing to hear that, and hopefully you would follow through and that's what you would see. But these are things that you can try and arrange even if it's not in the specifications. So those other things might be the problems if it's not in the specifications. Again, how much lead time, specific days, specific hours, how long you can be there, those are types of things to be worked out. Any questions on observation? It sounds probably very elementary, because for the most part it is. Satisfaction survey, and this again goes back to what it is that the contractor is performing. Who is the customer? And one of the things we said on day 2 was satisfaction survey, and what I have deemed to be passive type monitoring is more appropriate when you have a perhaps an indirect receiver of this activity, i.e. the general public. If you have a bus and a bus is serving people, what is the satisfaction of the riders of the bus? How do you gauge that? And usually the way you gauge that is some type of survey. That's one of the frequent things that you do. That you'll either, let's say, when someone comes onto the bus, they might be handed a survey and asked and given a prepaid envelope to mail it back, where they can be supposedly confidential and frank with their assessment. Maybe they're given a website address. If they have internet, that they can go on the internet and do a survey. But that's a good way to find out how the vendor is performing. if in this particular situation the vendor would be contracted to provide transportation services, which with the Department of Transportation, they have a number of commuter bus routes where they go for various places, Eastern Shore, Southern Maryland, I think as far as Frederick, things like that, and bring people into Baltimore, into Washington, etc. So they have contractors that are running these operations. One way to find out if the contractor is performing is to simply monitor complaints. That's another good activity. If you have lots of complaints, a vendor probably isn't doing something properly. But without even relying to complaints, since most people are more likely to just grumble and complain and talk to each other and do the complaining rather than actually go somewhere further and make a phone call or write a letter or send an email, complaints are good, but perhaps something like a survey to actually be given to people and asking them to respond might give you a better idea about the performance of the vendor. So the question, if you have a satisfaction survey, then the issues you need to be concerned with, aside from the fact you're going to have it, is what's going to be on it. Because many times what you've probably heard is when people do opinion polls, for instance, and they say, well, this is how people responded, and so this is how people feel about a particular subject. And almost every time that an opinion taker says this is the reaction of individuals to the poll that was taken, somebody who doesn't like the results will challenge the structure of the questions. And one of the things that you can do simply by the questions that are asked is kind of preordain or at least tilt the likelihood of getting a certain answer. If you give questions that the only logical answer is yes, because anything that would lead to no is kind of ridiculous, then you're going to get a lot of yes answers. And it wasn't because people liked things, they just weren't given enough choices to indicate what their true feeling were. And if you do require a satisfaction survey, one of the issues you have to focus on is the adequacy, appropriateness of the questions on the survey. Do they really get to the point of letting people give a true assessment of the vendor's performance? By the number of questions, the specific questions, just putting down, do they have only 3 categories? Excellent, fair, lousy. And if you have only 3 categories of choices and it's not lousy, do you give fair, do you give excellent? Maybe they'd rather give a pretty good, but they're not willing to give an excellent, so they give everybody a fair. And that's simply the way it's structured. So that's a consideration. Another consideration is who is going to administer the survey. Is it going to be administered by, is it going to be constructed and approved by the vendor? If it is, then it needs to be approved by the agency. Is it going to be constructed by the agency? If it is, then of course you construct it the way you want. Is a third party going to be paid to do it? And if so, again, the agency wants the ability to approve the questions and the structure of the survey. And who's going to administer? Is it going to be the vendor? Is it going to be the agency? Is it going to be a third party? Who is going to get the results? Is it going to come back to the vendor for the vendor to say, yep, everyone said we're doing a perfect job? Or is it going to be given to a neutral entity? Or is it going to come back to the agency for the agency to check the results that came in? Considerations. And obviously the purpose of a satisfaction survey is to measure the satisfaction of the contract end users with what they are receiving under the contract and usually solicit recommendation for approval. That's what a satisfaction is designed for. You don't use it if you have a contract manager, a single contract manager who's supposed to know what's going on. You use this type of a monitoring activity when you have multiple, usually many end users, and they're not as directly involved, such as I said, riders on buses or light rail or something like that. Let's see, aside from appropriate care being devoted to the contents of the questionnaire, care must be taken to identify appropriate persons to receive the survey. I mentioned that already. Determine the best means to distribute the survey to the people. Because it's nice if you have everything set up with wonderful questions and you have it set up of who's going to get it, who's going to do the analysis, but it has to get to the end user. So what's the best way to assure that a lot of the end users get the survey so that you get statistically significant results back from the survey? Follow up to ensure a significant number of surveys are completed and returned to make a statistically valid sample, and someone has to interpret the results. And then the reason why this is done is depending upon what the indication is from the survey. If the indications are that there is not proper performance, something has to be done. The contract manager has to contact the vendor and say, all right, now that we have the results of this survey, it shows that only 2% think you're doing a really good job, 20% think you're doing a fair job, 50% think you're doing a lousy job, and whatever the math is, another 18% think you shouldn't even exist as a company because they've never seen someone as bad in all their life. So if that's the result, what does the contract manager do about it? What does the state do about it? Do they implement liquidated damages? Do they give threats of termination? Something has to happen. If you remember from the, I don't know if the first day or the second day, probably the first day, we talked about what I would call the formula for successful contract management, and that was, if I remember correctly, detection, documentation, decisive action equals deterrence. Then this is part of that. You have to take action. That the survey gives you the detection, and the survey in and of itself has documentation, and then you need to do something about it. If you don't, you're just sending the message to the vendor of, so what? They found out that I'm not doing a good job, but apparently they're okay with the fact I'm not doing a good job because they haven't said anything to me, so I guess I can keep doing what I'm doing. Not a good formula for success. Another activity which is more focused, not a play on words, than a survey is a focus group. If you don't know how to get to 1,000 or 10,000 end users, maybe you can have a methodology to select a couple focus group type sessions, 1, 2, 3, 5, something of that nature, where instead of having perhaps hundreds or thousands of people coming back with opinions and relying upon the conscientiousness of the people to fill them out and how you've constructed them to find out the value of them, etc., you might, and these are not mutually exclusive, by the way. You can have both of these things. You can have surveys with the requirement being that among the people doing the survey, you can ask some of them, if they're willing to identify themselves, to come in for a focus group for more in-depth analysis. But probably you're hopefully familiar with focus groups where you have a small group of people who supposedly are representative of the individuals that do something or use something or know something, and you have a moderator. And the moderator is supposed to be skilled in asking questions and getting dialogue among the members of the focus group, where they feel relaxed and they feel comfortable and they feel that they can speak their mind frankly. And
like a Domino's commercial.
Domino's commercial?
Domino's commercial, where the people, they don't want to know what's in the food. They got like a little focus group talking about the cheese that people saying, well, Domino's they don't want me to know what's in their pizza. And then the walls break down and they're at a farm and they got tomatoes or at the dairy farm. Or cheese.
I haven't seen the Domino's commercial.
Yes. All right, thank you.
Focus group. All right. Have I seen it?
You've probably seen it.
I hate commercials.
Next time you'll see it, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Commercials
And
are
if you're
always
watching
biased.
this Sunday night, I know you'll be watching, probably be on that.
I mean, even when a football game's on, I try to do something else when the commercials are on. So I've seen some Domino's commercials, but not the particular one you're talking about. Okay.
The audience knows what we're talking about.
All right. See, that's why we have people around that have more insight than your moderator.
Yes, my keen insight by watching commercials.
Observation. Let's see. To elicit comments and contract performance suggestions. Then usually, and again, you want to put this in your specifications. You want to say how many focus groups there should be, if this is a methodology that you think is appropriate to use. How many focus groups, and you can specify. Minimum duration. You don't want a 15-minute focus group. You want a focus group that's going to let people get into the subject matter and get comfortable and start speaking up. And the other thing the moderator does is many times in focus groups, when you are trying to get people on a random basis sort of to come in, when you have them, then usually people fall into different categories. They're the one that likes to sit there and sort of be quiet and not say anything. There's the one who likes to control the group and speak up all the time. And what the moderator has to do is kind of get away from the one that wants to be answering every question every time and pull answers out of the people that are kind of quiet. And when one person says something, the moderator will say, oh, well, what do you think about that? Or what's your opinion of what he or she has just said? To try to get people to open up and speak their mind, because that's when you learn things, when people are frank. And it's one thing when they're sitting around at lunchtime with their co-workers and neighbors and things like that, and they can speak their mind very freely, but when you get in a more organized, formal environment, a lot of people are reticent to do that. So that's where you have to try to have the proper structure to get the value out of a focus group. You have the moderator, and typically it is recorded. And lots of times you have the two-way mirror, and the moderator will say, now there's people back on the other side of that two-way mirror that are watching and listening to what's going on. And there will be times when someone will walk in the room and hand the moderator a piece of paper, and the moderator will say, I've just been asked to follow up on a particular question or to ask this question because the people in the back are hearing something and they want more development of what they're hearing, or they want it to go in a different direction, something like that. So they're trying to get the maximum value out of the focus group. Depending on the type of contract involved, end users might be the general public, generally, or a specific segment, such if it's paratransit, the transportation for the disabled community, then you want it to be a subset of disabled individuals. If it could be state personnel, if someone is providing something, employee benefits. Just about every one of us enjoy the benefits through the health contracts, the pharmacy contract, etc. What do you think about the performance under the contract? So it might be state personnel. Stakeholders, business community, nonprofit organizations, community organizations, other governments, local governments, etc. What is the target of the focus group? Who are the end users? Care must be taken to pick the appropriate people, to pick the right moderator, to draft the appropriate questions, to properly evaluate. These are things, so it isn't enough to just say, have a focus group. Because the vendor can have a focus group and it can still be a worthless activity because the care wasn't done to make sure things are done correctly to get value out of the focus group. Focus group session might be required one time, let's say at the midpoint. When are you going to do this? Are you going to do it to learn of something while you can still do corrective action? Are you going to do it at the end to try to have something to apply the next time? Another aspect. Do you do it periodically so that, again, you try to get real-time analysis of performance so you can get change if necessary during the course of the contract? So how many focus groups are required and what is the timing of the focus group? When multiple focus group sessions are to be held, do you require them in different geographic areas? Are you going to get the same result from the same activity on the Eastern Shore as in Baltimore, as in Prince George's County, as in Frederick County, as in Garrett County? So, and what things you'll find is people have certain opinions on the Eastern Shore, certain opinions in Western Maryland, different opinions in Baltimore, and you just can't have one focus group in one area necessarily be representative of what people throughout the state think, or even employees in different parts of the state, or state employees in different agencies. So this is, again, part of the task of trying to figure out the appropriateness of how many, what type, who are the participants, etc. The end users. Do you mix the end users? So is there a geographic component? If so, you have them different places geographically. If there are different types of end users, you might have a focus group with one type of end user, another focus group with another type of end user, so you're getting their input. Things you have to think about. Sessions with different homogeneous groups of participants are done to evaluate if services are being provided uniformly in all locations or to all target populations. So one in the Eastern Shore and one in Western Maryland, are they going to both say the same thing, or does the Eastern Shore say the vendor's doing a great job and Western Maryland will say the vendor's doing a lousy job because in fact the vendor is doing a different level of performance in one area than another? If you had one focus group only, and let's say that focus group was in Baltimore and the vendor then knows that and concentrates on Baltimore, might be lousy performance in Western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. If you don't ask, you won't know, unless you rely upon complaints. But that's what you think about. Different locations or target groups might react differently to the same service delivery approach. Different locations or target groups might have different types of needs. So that's why you think about how many, where, how to structure. Nothing is ever easy. Remember that. For focus group sessions to be worthwhile, if indicated, changes need to be made in contract performance, the contract itself, and if it's the contract itself, you're doing a modification. We will talk in this class in great degree about modifications. Example, either the contractor needs to perform better, perhaps with more agency oversight, or the contract may need to be modified with different or additional deliverables, or both. So again, if you detect it and document it, then do something about it. Performance reviews. So any questions on focus groups? And you're thinking, yes, I knew what a focus group was before you even opened your mouth. So we spent 10 minutes on something we knew about. So but did they know that was a focus group? Okay, good. Smart bunch? Not so smart teacher? Okay. Performance reviews. A performance review is a formal periodic assessment of the contractor's performance. The assessments might be done weekly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, etc. Frequently, a formal assessment form, template, etc. is created so both parties know the contract aspects being assessed. And this is something, again, in the specifications that says that we are going to do this performance review. And it's going to say how frequently. And if it's going to be a proper monitoring tool, it needs to be frequently enough that you can, at appropriate intervals, monitor the vendor's performance. So if the vendor is not performing, you can then get remedial action for the vendor to get back on stream with performance. So you have to figure out how much you have to should create a form or a template, because you want both parties to know what is being assessed. On probably day 2, we talked about that if you have this type of assessment, that you have it structured, and frequently you have the vendor participate in the structure of this type of assessment, or at least be familiar with it. And if the agency does this assessment, it provides it to the vendor, so the vendor is aware of what the assessment is, and if it feels it is an improper assessment, it has the ability to do a rebuttal, either an explanation or something where it might be said, yes, there was this period when we weren't performing, and you can take a couple different scenarios. We had problems with turnover, and there was a period when we weren't performing, but now, as you know, we've gotten back to full staffing. I think you're very happy with our performance at this time. So even though there was a period when there was a rough spot, we're back on track. And so the next performance review should be showing everything fine. So that's one thing that could happen. Or sometimes what the vendor will say is not something that, yes, I admit we had a problem, and now we've corrected, sometimes what they'll say is, we were prevented from doing our job because either A, state personnel didn't do their job, that we couldn't move forward, excuse me, we couldn't move forward and do something until we either got something from the state, or we got a decision from the state, or we had to rely upon another contractor who wasn't giving us the information. So even though we admit the performance wasn't there, it wasn't there not because we weren't doing ready, willing, and able to do our job, but because something prevented us from doing our job. And obviously, just knowing that a vendor, an end result was not achieved is not sufficient. You need to know why it wasn't achieved, i.e., was it the vendor's fault, or was the vendor basically innocent and it was another situation that prevented them? Because if it's another situation, your focus needs to be different than on the vendor. If the vendor didn't perform because state personnel didn't do their job, you don't go to the vendor, you go to the state personnel. And if they're not doing their job, fine. If there's been turnover and there's not state personnel there to do the job, then something has to be done. Either you forgive the vendor for not performing because we know you can't do it till we have people. We don't have people, so we know you can't do it because we're preventing you, so you're not going to go and apply damages or whatever if that's the situation. But you need to know what the situation, what is the source of non-performance if there is non-performance. If you don't know the source, you can't target the solution to the problem. Talking about performance reviews can be done 3 ways. And I probably touched on this. Both parties independently do an assessment using the form and then compare those assessments with discussion of differences. So having established the questionnaire or the template or whatever it is to do the survey, this first approach is, okay, I, the state contract manager or someone within the state, is going to complete it from my perspective. You, the vendor, your contract manager, or someone within your organization is going to complete it. So we both do it on our own, and then we basically get together and look at each other's answers. And hopefully they would not be radically different. But if they are, then that shows you there's a problem of perception somewhere. And that's where, again, you have to focus on, why do they think they're doing an excellent job and I think they're doing a terrible job? We need to focus on how do we get to these different opinions, and maybe it's because they just don't want to admit reality, or maybe because something I have seen is the state expects vendors to do something that are not in the contract. And so sometimes the perception is you're doing a lousy job and the contractor says, for what I was contracted to do, I think I'm doing a very good job, but you keep coming to me and asking me to do things that aren't in the contract. And sometimes that is a reality. Sometimes that does happen. And in the second day, we had an example of one of the what would you do situation where in a housekeeping contract, the vendor complained that the state was expecting them to do things that were not appropriate, and ended up having a meeting and found out that a person, this was the one where there was a school involved, and the vendor wasn't supposed to clean the school, and the contract manager for the state came to them when they lost a person and said, well, can you clean the school? And the vendor said yes, and then the contract manager said, and we can't pay you any more money to do it. And for a couple months, the vendor did the work without any more money and got to the point that they said they couldn't do it anymore. Vendors do at times do work beyond the scope of the contract, or are asked to do work beyond the scope of the contract. So you need to be able to identify these type of activities. Second way it can be done is the agency performs a review and provides the results to the contractor, with the contractor providing comments, agreement or disagreement, or if there is essentially agreement, a remediation plan. Now that you admit that there has been subpar performance, tell me how you're going to get back on track. And I don't think we did remediation plans on the second day, did we? So we're going to have it more, I guess, today. And the third way for this to be done is an entirely third party, not the vendor, not the state, to do the performance review, providing the results both to the contractor and the agency of what their assessment was, with both parties providing comments, etc., about agreement, disagreement, remediation, etc. So these are performance reviews. A performance review is different from a report card. We talked about report cards in the second day. Report cards were more on generic issues. Generally, is the vendor timely? Is the vendor responsive? Is the vendor courteous? Is it like a Boy Scout, courteous, trustworthy? I forgot all the things, but more on abstract activities such as quantity, quality, timeliness, expense. So the report, and while the report card measures general contract attributes or performance, the quality assurance activity, all right, I've gone to something. Let's see. Performance review is different from a report card. The report card was the abstract, and a performance review is against the specific deliverables. So the one is more abstract. This is against the actual contract and whether they're performing against the actual contract. So that's the difference between a performance review and a report card, as we discussed on the second day. All right, moving on. Any questions on performance reviews? A question? Someone actually stops me from just talking endlessly.
So if you have a third party do the review,
yes,
who's going to pay for it?
Third party review, who's going to pay for it? And again, that's something you will determine in advance. You can either require the vendor to pay for it, and they include that in their price, or you can pay for it yourself. I mean, obviously, even if the vendor does it and is required to do it for their expense, you're going to pay for it indirectly. The difference, the key difference in whether the vendor pays for it or the state pays for it is if the vendor pays for it, they are responsible to get the entity that does the monitoring, usually with state approval, so they don't pick someone that is going to favor them because they're the ones that's paying their way. But if the state does it, then generally you have the issue now of doing a procurement. And we all know that everyone shudders at the thought of doing a procurement, because procurements are endless activities that are hard work and are always a nightmare. So if we can avoid a procurement, we do it. We make the vendor responsible for getting the third party. So that's something that, if it's done, frequently the responsibility is put on the vendor to obtain the third party, but there have to be sufficient safeguards that there is actual independence, and the vendor, just because they hire them and pay them, cannot orchestrate the results. But that is something, you're very correct, where you should address it. If you're going to this third party, very important. And hopefully if you don't address it at a pre-bid conference or something like that, the vendor's going to say, who pays for it? And so then you can address it, but that's what you need to figure out. Any other questions? I like questions. Stops me from droning. And I know I put people to sleep at times. At times, put me to sleep. And most of you can never tell. Quality assurance audit. This activity is frequently performed under different names. It often is called independent validation and verification, IV&V, or a performance audit, something of that nature. This is where, again, you do have, well, let me just read the slide. Usually this involves agency audit personnel, either agency audit personnel or an outside contractor performing a formal audit of the contractor's performance using formal audit techniques. Audit means there are ways to do audits, there's accepted procedures, and if you're talking about a quality assurance audit, the expectation is it's being done through normal accepted auditing procedures. And this is, if you ask for this, the reason why you ask for this is the premise that independent personnel using formal audit techniques, procedures, are more likely to ascertain the contractor's true performance status. That's why you use this type of an activity for monitoring. This type of audit is not conducted by the agency contract manager. That's why we said it's going to be by somebody who actually does auditing by formal auditing techniques. So to a degree, a QA, quality assurance, audit is an audit of both the contractor's performance and the agency's contract management practices. If you have somebody independent who is doing this assessment, then this person should be able to tell whether there is proper performance, and if there isn't, what is the root cause perhaps of that performance, which sometimes is the state, or sometimes what it will reveal is, yes, the vendor is not performing, and then the higher ups in the agency might ask the question, well, how come we didn't know they weren't performing? Why am I getting no information whatsoever that tells me the vendor is as lousy as this QA audit indicates there are? And so in a way, it is critiquing the state's contract management of the vendor if there is widespread evidence of lack of performance by the QA audit and nothing from the other auditing techniques or monitoring techniques by the state to indicate anything of that nature, then you got a problem with your state monitoring activities. Example, a QA audit may reveal inadequacies in the contractor's performance, but also that the agency contract manager was lax in permitting the contractor to perform inadequately without taking action to seek contract compliance. That's why this might be a very good tool to apply. The other aspect of this, well, let me go through this and see if I've discussed this before I tell you. All right, let's see. The right to have such audits and for the contractor to fully cooperate needs to be written in the solicitation contract. So you want in there that you're going to do it, and the vendor must fully cooperate with the auditor for any of these activities. But the agency needs to, and again, it's one thing to have it in the specifications. The second bullet is the agency needs to follow through and actually have one or more audits performed. Hollow threats don't get action if the vendor believes it is a hollow threat. The right to do it but never doing it conditions them to as just hollow words. Perhaps with the provision that deficiencies beyond a specified level will trigger a re-audit at a shorter time interval, or the issue of payment. If we do it or if we pay for it, we can have specified, if we have this in the specs to begin with, that we can have the report card with A, B, C, D, etc. And we can say that we will do this once annually, except if the vendor scores a D or an E, figuratively speaking, or scores below a certain number, below a 60, let's say, out of 100. Then instead of it being an annual activity, it'll be done semi-annually, quarterly. And if we are going to pay for the annual, we can say if there is a need because of their performance at an annual audit to trigger a semi-annual or a quarterly, the vendor is responsible to pay for the audits beyond what we have specified because they're only being done because of their non-performance. So again, obviously, these are things we need to say in the specifications in order to go back to a vendor and say, all right, you are below the specified threshold. Now we're going to do another one in 3 months and you're going to pay for it. And they shouldn't have the ability to come back and say, wait a minute, there's nothing in the specs about me paying money. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to cooperate unless the state pay it, accept the whole thing. You want it in your specifications. All right, now since I haven't said any more, going back to this activity, that again is something that needs to be addressed in your specifications. If you're going to have this done, who is going to pay for it? And if it's the vendor, you need to tell them so they can build it into their price. If it's the state, you need to have a mechanism. Do you do a procurement to get a vendor to have them on board? If it's a 5-year contract, they know they're going to do this once annually with the possibility they might do it semi-annually, quarterly under certain circumstances. So identifying the issue of payment gets to the same issue that was brought up of what do you do, who puts it in their funding, do you have to do a procurement, and you need to know this. If you have to do a procurement, then you do a procurement to get a vendor. Because if you don't have a vendor through a procurement, you don't have a vendor. If you don't have a vendor, you're not going to do it. If you're not going to do it, it's worthless to have said you're going to do it. It might be something that you can do with a small procurement, and small procurements are much, 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 much easier than a non-small procurement, but you need to address the issue. Any questions on that topic? Anything you want to? Does Domino's do anything with quality assurance audits?
I have nothing I'm aware of, no.
All right, there's no commercials on Domino quality assurance audits. Drafts. Lots of times, thought I heard something. I lots of times think I hear things. If there is a report, a study, a survey among the deliverables of a state contract, or even if that is the whole purpose of a state contract, to get a report or a study, etc., then one of the things that we want to require is that the vendor simply doesn't give you a final report, that you will get a draft. You will get a draft that is subject to your review, and you have to sort of like what the vendor is saying. You don't want them to give you a final report that you think is inadequate, that you think is going down the wrong track, that is inflammatory, that you wouldn't want the thing to be seen by the general public or something like that. So you don't want a vendor to simply give a report, say, give me my money, and then you suffer the consequences without having any ability to help mitigate the consequences because you didn't require a draft that was subject to your approval. So you want to require, anytime there is a report, a study, etc., you want to, in your specifications, say, you must give me a draft. And the format of the draft should be specified, as should the time frame to provide the draft, and such things as it should be free of errors, it should be written as if it were the final version, it must be approved by the agency. This should all be in your specifications. Along with saying the draft must be approved by the agency, what this means. And what this means typically means that if the agency isn't satisfied with the veracity of the study, if they're not satisfied the vendor took the right steps or went to enough people or did enough analysis, that we can go back to them and say, we need more substantiation for what you've said. All right, I see that you're giving a recommendation or you're giving an analysis, but when you give the substantiation for why you got to that point, we don't think it's going to hold water. First of all, we don't believe it, but if we have to sell this to the legislature, if we have to sell it to the governor, if we have to sell it to the general public, we don't think this is going to persuade anybody. So you need to go back and you need to come up with more facts and more information that justifies this position if you think this is the position that should be taken on this particular subject matter. So that's the first thing. We have the right to ask them to do more if we think it's inadequate. To make any changes that we require. And there is one big exception to this. If you want, let's say, a frank professional opinion, we should not try to control what that opinion is. If an auditor is going in and doing an audit according to generally accepted auditing procedures, we can't say to the vendor, oh, we don't like your audit finding. You found too many instances where you said we didn't do a good job, so you need to change your report to say we're doing everything fine. So that's the limitation, that if it's that type of activity where it is their professional judgment as to the propriety of something, then number one, we shouldn't seek to have them change it. And number two, if they're a true professional, they will refuse to change it. And I've had vendors where we didn't think we were asking for something that smacked of professional impropriety, where they have said, we don't think that given our level of independence that we should implement the change that you have said. And then we've had dialogue as to why they thought it was something of that nature and why we didn't, and usually it's somewhere in between. But if it's just other than something for integrity, where it is their professional opinion, we have the right to control as far as how the report is said, what is being said, what the substantiation is, things of that nature. And if we require changes, we need to give them in the specs the time frame to make that. And one of the things I've said, well, I probably said this in the planning class, one of the frequent omissions in doing specifications is time frames. We generally are pretty good in telling a vendor what they need to do. And frequently, we're not very good in telling them when they have to do it. And one of the ridiculous things that I will throw out is, okay, if a vendor is supposed to give a report and you don't say when, well, can they give it to you on the last day of a 3-day contract? Or do they have to give it to you on the first day of a 3-year contract, into the 6 months? It makes a whole lot of difference when they're going to give you the report. And if you don't specify when, and you go back to them and say, where's that report you're supposed to give me? They have the right to say, well, it didn't say when, so I was planning to give it to you a year from now. You need to say when. Once all this is in the contract, the agency needs to enforce these provisions. Number one, conscientiously read the draft. Don't ask for a draft if no one's going to read it and no one's going to react to it. If they're not going to read the draft, then what's the purpose of doing this whole thing to begin with? Circulate the draft to appropriate agency personnel. You want that draft to go to the people who have a say in what is on there, to get their reaction from different perspectives. So get it, circulate it, give your own personnel a time frame to respond. We want your comments back in 3 days. You don't tell that to the vendor, but you tell your own personnel they have the same issue of timeliness. Provide the required feedback. That's where the agency should provide the feedback. Do so within the time frame written in the contract. Lots of times we will say, we will provide feedback to you within 5 business days. If we tell the vendor we're going to give feedback within 5 business days, we should give informed feedback within 5 business days. Because another thing I say all the time is a contract is a two-way street. And the vendor can say, well, I can't give you the final report until you approve the draft report, and I've given you the draft report, and you were supposed to get back to me in 5 working days. It's been 2 weeks now. So since you didn't tell me whether the draft report was okay, I can't finalize the draft report, so I can't give it to you in the time frame. And you can see how, well, how can you hold a vendor to doing a requirement when this is an example of how we have prevented them from doing what they're required to do. Get the feedback to them. Delays in responding to the draft may prevent the contractor from providing the final version within the required time frame, but don't accept the contractor's product if you aren't satisfied it was based upon sound research, surveying, etc. It's better to miss a deadline than accept bad work. Let's see. All right. So drafts. Any question on drafts? And frequently in specifications, I will see requirements for drafts, and most of this other information is just not there. And so this is one of the frequent things that I do with agencies. Okay, is it okay if the vendor gives you the draft the day before the final report is due? And I'll start with something ridiculous like that. And they'll say, oh no, that's not acceptable. We can't turn this around in 1 day. Okay, then when do you want it? Oh, I want it at least 2 weeks before the final report. All right, now that's something you're going to put in your specifications. And so we go through all these issues, and they say, oh, okay, yeah, I can see where we should do that. So I'm telling you all this stuff up front so it doesn't get to the point that someone has to come back to you and ask you about these things after the fact, or not come back to you and it's just not in there.
The other thing I'd add, Joel, is not only do we define our approval of the draft, but I think the key here is don't accept the contractor's product if you're unsatisfied. We need to indicate our level of acceptance of this product that they're going to give us. And the acceptance means that it has to meet our objective or it has to comply with the specifications. Not only do we say, look, we've got the right to accept, to approve this, which naturally we should have, but there should be some definition of what the term acceptance means. They could give us something that they thought met our expectations, and we're going to say, we're not going to accept this, and here's why. So I think you need to make sure there's an understanding of what the word acceptance means.
We talk frequently about acceptance standards. To the degree that we can quantify this for something like this, we should. We always should be as specific as possible about acceptance standards, because something that you could get to in something like this is you could say that the vendor's research and their draft is, in so many words, so lousy. Number one, we don't even want you to go ahead and try to finalize this. We just think you are so inept at doing this work that we will not accept the draft, we will not have you go on and do a final product, and maybe even we don't pay you for what you've done to this point in time. It could get to that point. Now, hopefully, if you've done your procurement properly, you're not going to get a vendor that you will have to basically reject as being totally unable to do the work. But it is something that could happen. And it's always better to know sooner than later whether a vendor is performing or not likely to perform, etc. And the more you can have as far as what are the standards for acceptance, the better. Things like the proper grammar. Now that should be obvious, that they don't write something that's unintelligible. But another thing that should have been part of the evaluation is their research methodology. Like, what is their expertise in this field? How many different activities, where are they going to go to get their subject matter? How many interviews are they going to do? How many surveys? How many focus groups? How many of everything, so that you know in advance whether they seemingly are following the right approach, that you will be able to accept their recommendation. And that's why I keep saying all this is so interrelated. If you don't do the procurement properly and don't do an evaluation properly, then that's more likely, I'm not saying unlikely, but more likely, you will get to the point of a vendor that is not quite capable of doing what you want than if you did everything properly. So the first thing is, if you're doing something that requires a study, generally, and I guess this is a generalization, I would think you would be doing this by either competitive sealed proposals or multi-step sealed bidding, where you have an evaluative factor to the selection of the vendor, rather than a simple competitive sealed bidding where it's, we want to study, give me a price. You want to have the ability to get the information on their capability and evaluate, so that you're picking a vendor that seemingly will be able to do the work. And then this is the other part, you follow through and you have drafts. And then the final, of course, is the result of the draft and all the things that you said you had the right to require corrections, further substantiation, etc. And if there's a draft and you tell them to do corrections, then that again comes back to you as a draft. So you're continually in the draft stage until you tell them, we're okay now, write this up now as a final document. So that's why drafts are so important. It can be draft 1, draft 2, draft 3, all before it's finalized. If you tell them to do it and they still don't do it to your satisfaction, and you tell them to do it again, etc., and then eventually either you're going to get to a final, or you might get to the point you say, I'm sorry, you just can't do this work, we're not going to have you do it any further, and then you decide whether you're paying them for what they've done. But it shouldn't get to that point. Okay. It'd be nice if I could move the slide. All right. This is the next one, right? I didn't jump to a slide. So again, any questions on drafts? Isn't this exciting stuff? When we had the planning class and we asked people for comments and recommendation, one of their comments was, about every half hour, have people stand up and do jumping jacks and things like that, because of the fact that I put people to sleep, and so they need to have a group invigoration session. Do you all feel that you need a group invigoration? Isn't this exciting stuff?
Amen.
To exciting stuff, or the opposite? Oh yeah, this is exciting. All right, moving on past, well, this is still monitoring techniques, but this is a little different aspect to monitoring. We're now going to give you some guidelines, I guess, if I can say it that way, on internal correspondence. What is internal correspondence relative to contract management? And essentially, that is where the contract manager or other people within the agency that have a role, some ROLE, somehow in the performance of the contract, will do memos, will do surveys, will do something that is staying within the agency, ergo internal correspondence. And frequently the term that's used is a letter to the file, which simply means you're writing something, and I will admit, the first time I ever heard this, something like 30 years ago, I was like, what do you mean a letter to the file? I'm writing a letter to the file cabinet? And I didn't know. And that was around 30 years ago. And then I was educated to what a letter to the file meant. It means that you have beeping. It means you simply write as if you were going to send it to somebody, but instead of actually sending it, you put it in the contract management file that you're supposed to have so that anybody who follows you, whether it's someone who replaces you as the contract manager, whether it's an auditor that comes in to audit the work, there's something in there that is written real time when something occurred or should have occurred, which says what the situation was at that time. Because it is always extraordinarily difficult and often impossible after the fact, 6 months, a year, 2 years after the fact, to reconstruct something if you don't write it up when it's happening. Because it's fresh in your mind, you can put the details, you can put the nuances, and 2 years down the road when all the personnel have changed, there's nothing in the file, usually the answer is there's no documentation, we can't prove anything, we just have to accept what the vendor gave us. So this is a means to help combat that, to have the detail, to have the letter in the file, or to have an email or something like that sent within the agency between the contract manager, the procurement officer, the assistant attorney general, your assistant secretary, your deputy secretary, your program manager, whoever it is, that talks about issues, that asks for responses, that notes certain things. And all of those, all this type of correspondence is supposed to be retained in the agency contract management file. So it is there if there's agreement. One of the things I said that frequently happens when you have a dynamic type contract where the vendor isn't told exactly what to do, but they are told, go out and do studies, come back with recommendations, and we have to approve the recommendations before you go to the next step. You need some indication that you approved or disapproved what the vendor told you. And that would be, first of all, internal correspondence, which should be followed by actual correspondence to the vendor, but at least you need to have the internal. For instance, if you say to the vendor, don't do something, all the vendor's going to know is, no, we didn't agree with it. If someone wants to know the rationale, that should be an internal correspondence as to why that decision was reached, so that if it is questioned a couple years in the future, the rationale is there. So you should have, as necessary, internal correspondence pertaining to the contract management, the vendor's performance.
Question.
Yes.
Under letters to the file, I feel very uncomfortable that it said performance that aren't sent to anyone. My reaction is that anything in the contract management file should indeed have been sent to someone else, even if it was to supervision. There should be nothing in the letter, in the file that wasn't sent to anyone.
Okay. I mean,
The email
if that's your
memos,
procedure, fine.
that's
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. You make your own decision how much should be simply a letter to the file to memorialize something versus not a letter to the file, but simply a copy of emails that went back and forth that are in the file. So you have to make your own decision on which way to go. Yes?
I have a question now with, emails and all the electronic stuff. What do you choose to print out and put in a file? versus, retain electronically?
What do you choose to print out and put in the file? Anything that you think is appropriate to have in the file.
The document can be obtained either way. I mean, if there's a request to look at documents, they can go back and look at your emails, whether we can print them out, they can ask them.
Yeah, the problem, as something that's been said before, emails are forever. I mean, I haven't said it in this class, I don't think, but something I was at with the Board of Contract Appeals, and that was the heading, emails are forever. They are always somewhere in the state archives. All the emails are retained. The problem is finding them. Well, how do you know that a particular email was sent at a particular time on a particular subject? Well, you can do the find or search type activity, but if you don't know what the key words are, if you don't know what was in the title, things of that nature may be unproductive, versus if you print it out and put it in a file, then obviously it is known there was an email. Now maybe knowing there was a particular email at a particular date, you could go back now and do a search for whatever file or archives that email is part of. But I would say anything that you think is of any significance, and you have to make your own judgment as to what is an appropriate document to retain. But I would rather have more than too many than too few.
You got to keep your opinions out of it and be factual and be specific. Because always remember that anything you document could end up seeing the light of day at some time. So keep your opinions out and try to keep it as factual as possible. But I don't have any problem documenting the file and not sending it anywhere. Just document a phone call I made, or I mean, back in the days.
We're going to get to phone calls.
Back in the days before we had emails, we did this all the time. We would routinely just keep a log and write down who we talked to and what the situation was. And, we've always, at the end of the day, to enforce your case, you have to have documentation. And the simplest form of this is just a letter to the file. Nothing formal. Here's what happened today.
Something Mark said is very true. You don't want to put anything in an email that you do not want have exposed at some point in time to a vendor or the vendor's attorney or something like that. You don't want to. You're pointing to Gary, so we're going to. Gary can.
When you're done.
When I'm done. You don't want to have inflammatory statements in there that indicate, if I can put it this way, you're out to get a vendor, and you don't care how good they're doing the job. I'm still going to tell them they're doing lousy, and I still don't want to pay them, etc. Number one, you shouldn't be doing that, but number two, you have to be very careful of what you're saying, even if you think it's not going anywhere else. At some point in time, under a subpoena, because emails are forever, they could go back and potentially find it. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. Excuse me.
I want to get back for a second to something that Joe said. If you're going to write something about a vendor, then you're writing it for a purpose, either to let someone else who's going to maybe one day manage this contract know something that might not be obvious, but that the vendor knows about and you know about, so you're documenting it to the file, or you're putting into that file something that's telling you to follow up with something else. And I think part of our, or at least part of my difficulty, is remembering to follow up with vendors on certain points that they may have agreed to have done. So what I try to do is send myself an email, and group-wise you can send a delayed email that reminds me, because I don't know how to use that task thing that we have. But that's how I do it. So people do it with the task thing, and that's fine too. But yeah, whatever you're putting in the file is something that, if it concerns you enough that you're writing a memo about it, the vendor should know about it. And if it's something that pertains to strategy on the next contract, for example, that may be something you want to put in the file that the vendor doesn't need to really know about. So there are two different purposes. But I agree with Joel absolutely that anything you write can be discoverable at some point. So don't let that hold you back from writing something. Just write factual information, or I think you can write opinion as long as it's based upon facts. Okay, so,
Yeah, there's nothing that says that you can't have an opinion, but you don't want to use derogatory language or inflammatory language. That idiot contract manager, you just don't want to write something that you wouldn't want someone to read. And there's a difference between opinion and being slanderous or something of that nature. So just remember, just because it's internal doesn't mean it's necessarily always and forever internal. All right, all such correspondence should be retained in the contract management file to document decisions that were reached, why those decisions were reached, approvals of past or future actions, acceptance or non-acceptance of contractor performance, deliberations concerning possible future actions. On slide 155, it is mentioned that only the contract manager should communicate directly with the contractor except for official actions by the procurement officer. So if you remember slide 155, which probably actually wasn't 155, because one of the things I did mention is this is still a kind of dynamic class. You get the slides piecemeal because they're getting approved by our attorney piecemeal. And so at the end of the day, these slide references don't match. They will the next time this class is given, because by then the whole class will have been vetted by the attorney, everything will be fine. But for this one, you are kind of the guinea pigs. This is a prototype class. This is the first real version of this 5-day class. So one of the detriments is you get confusing piecemeal handouts that don't have proper slide references. So back somewhere we mentioned that for the most part, only the contract manager for the state should communicate with the vendor so that there's a single consistent voice. And the exception to that is the procurement officer is the only one that can do certain things. And so obviously that rule doesn't apply when the procurement officer is the only one who can do terminations or show cause letters or modifications, things of that nature. But the contract manager, the procurement manager shouldn't do things without the knowledge of the contract manager. That's what's said back on around slide 155. All right, but often, so going to this next point, so even though there should be one person, for the most part, delivering a single message, that doesn't mean that person makes all decisions in isolation. Usually, or frequently, that person is going to have consultation internally. The contract manager may go to the procurement officer, may go to their senior management, may go to the assistant attorney general and discuss various things. And then, based upon guidance or consensus, whatever the situation, the contract manager is the one who then delivers the message to the vendor. But usually, again, it's not simply a one-person decision. And so any of these deliberative type memos or emails should be in, that's internal correspondence, should be in the file. Let's see, all this should be retained in the contract management file. Internal correspondence kept in the contract management file may include a contractor contact log. So this is where we're coming to your point now, and something that Mark has already said. Contractor contact log. This contact log should record informal contacts made with the contractor staff to communicate likes, dislikes, directions, etc. In other words, simply some kind of recording that says on December 2nd at 10:25 a.m. I called such and such vendor, talked to Charlie or Jane or Mary or whomever, had a 5-minute conversation in which I communicated that they should do something, they shouldn't do something, just a very brief summation of what the conversation, who was in the conversation, what the conversation was about, what supposedly was verbally agreed if it gets to that point in the conversation. So let's see. Informal contacts include telephone calls, incidental contacts, so it's beyond just phone calls. If it's something where you encounter the vendor in the hall, or you're going to a trade show and you're talking to the vendor's representative, your contact is at the trade show, and you have contract-related conversation. Anytime you have these informal type contacts where you're talking about the contract, the performance of the contract, you should record who, what, when, what was said, etc. And you should keep that in your contract management file for perhaps usage in the future. And I will get to that. So let's see. Each time informal communication is made with a person in a position of responsibility with the contractor, a record should be made as follows. Person of responsibility, not just someone who's sweeping the floor, but someone, your counterpart is the contract manager, senior vice president, something like that. Who the contact was with, the date and time, the circumstance, how was it that you had this informal contact? Did you specifically make a phone call, or did you happen to see the person at an event that you weren't expecting to see them there, but you saw them, you talked about it, there was some agreement, you're memorializing it. What you said, what was said back to you. By keeping such a contact log when formal contact is made for a problem situation, for instance, if you get to a formal meeting, a formal letter, something of that nature, if you have a contact log, and if you have mentioned this same issue several times before, then you can say, not just for the first time I am now telling you, you can say, I have brought this up on this date, on this date, on this date. I was told this the first time. I was told the same thing with more conviction the second time. I was told the third time, absolutely, without a doubt, we'll have it. You'll have it by this date. You shouldn't worry your mind about it another second. So this is what I was told on these 3 occasions. None of this has happened. Now I'm writing to you, but this isn't the first time we've brought it up, because here's the 3 instances where I brought it up. The first time was, again, this date, this time, this person. Here's what I was told. Second time was with the same person, with a different person. Here's what I was told, etc. So obviously, if you can put in a formal communication multiple instances previously of this issue, and hopefully not 100 of them, where it's obvious that they're just stringing you along and you're doing nothing about it, but a couple formal contacts and actual statements that they've made, it will have more weight and it'll have more evidence to the vendor. Because you haven't done anything, I've had to resort to now this formal letter from the procurement officer or the contract manager telling you you need to do a remediation plan because you haven't followed through with anything where I tried to do this on a less formal basis, so I have to do it formally and have to give you formal timeframes, etc. So that's why it helps to have the recording of these instances, because it's just more ammunition if you have to go further. Well, let me finish the slide. Time out because it's break time or because you want to say something?
Are you done with the slide?
Am I done with the slide? You're on? Well, not me. Often the fact that you documented prior encounters when the issue was discussed bolsters your formal request. It illustrates you tried to have something resolved informally before resorting to a formal complaint. Yes, I'm done with that slide. Let me see what's on the next slide. All right, appropriate since we're going from internal to external. So we will take our 15-minute break.